Okay, this is Miss Carr, and today we are going to be learning about protein synthesis. And this is to answer the question from earlier about, well, why is DNA important? What does DNA do for us? And just about everybody knows that DNA is like the code for building any living organism. But what we're going to be talking about is how does that actually happen? How do you go from a DNA molecule, which we've talked about earlier this week, to an actual living, breathing, organism? And just to review what proteins are, remember that proteins make up all living material. This includes your hair and your nails and your muscles and your cell messengers. You have receptor proteins throughout your cell membrane and your antibodies. These are the proteins that protect and defend your body from bacteria and viruses and infections. And your blood and your brain and your nerves and all of your enzymes and hormones and other protein related tools that your body uses to help you do things like digest food. Also your cellular construction workers. You have huge groups or clusters of proteins that do all of your cells' heavy lifting, literally. And so it is important to understand the huge role that your proteins are playing within your body and within all of your living cells. Okay? Now, proteins are composed of amino acids, and there are about 20 different amino acids, and every protein is created using a chain of these amino acids that forms a shape. And proteins are determined by their shape. Their function is determined by their shape. So you have this chain of amino acids. I want you to think of like a chain of beads that the shape that the beads are going to make is determined by what order you place them in. And so you have about 20 different ones, but you can put them in any order imaginable. And this is why you have an almost unlimited number of different kinds of proteins, because you have 20 different building blocks that you can use in any combination or any order. Okay, also different proteins, they can be made by combining these with in different combinations, in different orders, and in different numbers. You have some proteins that are made of only 3 or 4 different amino acids, but you combine them in different numbers. Okay. Now, before we get started, I want to make sure that you have this one thing in your notes, and that is the central dogma, that's the belief, this understanding of protein synthesis. And this is what we understand most about the way our body operates. We know that all of the coding, all of the information is coded in our DNA. And there's a process called transcription that allows us to take that DNA and create mRNA out of it. And that mRNA is then taken from the nucleus to the ribosome. And this, through a process called translation, this creates a protein. So this is going to be our guide throughout this entire process, and if you can understand and remember just this, then everything else will fall into place. So our path here is DNA to mRNA to protein, and the processes that we're going to talk about are transcription and translation. So keep that in mind as we go through this process. Okay. A few pieces of basic information that you need to know in order to understand this process is that proteins are made in the ribosomes. Now, you find ribosomes floating around freely in the cytoplasm. That's just kind of the jelly-like inside of the cell, but you also find them attached to the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Now, a ribosome just looks like a dot when we do our cell model, and so you just have these dots. But when you really start looking closely at a ribosome, you find that there are 2 subunits. And we have a large subunit and a small subunit. And these 2 pieces fit together like 2 pieces of a puzzle. So we'll talk a little more about what happens when those two subunits come together in a minute. Now, why is this process so important, especially important enough for us to spend as much time as we're about to spend on it? And that is the importance of proteins altogether. So again, to review, they help us fight disease, okay? They help us build new body tissue, and they create enzymes used for digestion and all sorts of other chemical reactions in our body, and all of those enzymes are proteins. Okay, they speed up the rate of a reaction. Remember, we spoke about enzymes being catalysts, meaning that they cause reactions within our body to happen at a higher rate of speed. And also, they are the primary component of all cell membranes. Remember, we have our lipids of the bilayer down here, but the protein channels that allow things to be transported across the membrane, as well as protein molecules that help identify the cell to other cells in our body, those are all proteins. So keep that in mind. The first step in making a protein is to get the information where it needs to go. I want you to consider for a moment for the KFC. KFC has a special recipe, and that special recipe can never leave the office of the owner of the company, okay? And just for the sake of the argument, we're going to call that guy Colonel Sanders, right? Now, we know Colonel Sanders isn't really a real guy, but he's the icon for KFC. So we'll say that he keeps the secret recipe for his chicken in his office in a safe, because having that original of the recipe is really important, and he doesn't want anyone getting that information or stealing that information from him. However, he can't make his chicken or have people make his chicken in the restaurants if they don't have at least the basics of the recipe. And so keeping that information in a safe in his office isn't the best way to make his chicken. So he has to have a way to get that recipe to every restaurant in the entire world. So instead of taking that original copy of the recipe that they've had for like 100 years, they have to make copies and send it out to the other people in their restaurants. So the first step to making a protein is the copying of that genetic information, because we can't take the original out of the nucleus. Just like Colonel Sanders doesn't want his original recipe to leave his office. So he's not going to send out the original copy. He's going to send out, or the original, he's going to send out copies. Now, the first step is going to be to copy this genetic information. You're copying that DNA to RNA. This process is called transcription, which literally means to write again. So this is just a copy of the information. You're not changing it into anything different. You are just making a copy. Now, the purpose of this, the biggest question is why? Why do we need a copy of the genetic code? And the simple answer to that is that ribosomes are where the protein synthesis happens, where proteins are made, and the nucleus is where the DNA is, and the DNA can't leave the nucleus. So because the DNA is too large, it's got 2 strands, but RNA can leave the nucleus because it's single-stranded. Okay, so DNA has this genetic code, and that genetic code needs to go out to the ribosome. And mRNA can do this. RNA is small, and it can copy just small pieces of the DNA. Okay, so what happens during this process, again, this process is called transcription. Okay, during this process, part of the DNA unzips. There's an enzyme that does this, again, proteins. So there's an enzyme for this. We come along and unzip this DNA. And we use this as a template. And the mRNA comes in and it makes a copy of a small portion of this DNA. So this is the mRNA, this small piece right here. You'll notice it says down here that it's the RNA strand. So the mRNA comes along, copies the unzipped DNA, and then goes through the pores of the nucleus. Remember, the nuclear membrane has these big holes in it called nuclear pores. And this DNA code attaches to the ribosome. Okay, so you have your ribosome, and it's hard to see in this picture, but you have your ribosome down here. And this is where the mRNA goes. So mRNA copies the DNA, leaves the nucleus, attaches to a ribosome. Okay. Now I'm going to make a separate video for the making a protein. So I'm going to stop for right now and make the next video to talk about translation. So we just finished talking about transcription and how the mRNA copies the DNA to leave the nucleus. Okay. And we should be able to show the next video and the next